All right. I've already given you a written introduction that talks about Thoreau's career and life. So I wanted to give a short personal introduction to the assignments you'll be reading in connection with Thoreau, the excerpts from Resistance to Civil Government and Walden. First, Resistance to Civil Government. Thoreau wrote Resistance to Civil Government after being arrested for not paying his taxes and spending a night in jail. And that experience of not paying his taxes, he did it as a protest because the government was supporting slavery and because the government was preparing to go and fight the Mexican War, which he thought was an act of tyranny and a land grab. So, in the interests of challenging that, the only interaction he ever had with the government was when the tax collector showed up in person to pick up the taxes each year. So he refused to pay. Eventually, he was jailed for this. Now, Thoreau was perfectly happy to go to jail. As a matter of fact, it was, if not quite a conscious decision, a willing decision on his part. He felt he was making a political statement. You can't have my money to support these things that I don't agree with. And now his friends came and paid and bailed him out within a day or two. And he was kind of mad because they ruined his political statement by getting him out of jail. He was no longer suffering for a cause. But anyway, the result of this experience and his thoughts about it is the essay that he entitled Resistance to Civil Government. After his death, there were publishers who retitled the essay On the Necessity of Civil Disobedience, and it is most commonly known by those last two words, which is the title they've given it in your textbook, Civil Disobedience. It came to be known as this because civil disobedience, in the larger sense that we see it used today by protesters, as we saw it used by Dr. King in the Civil Rights era, and as Gandhi used it to free India from British rule, is the name given to the behaviors and the theory of nonviolent resistance that Thoreau promotes in his essay. Thoreau really didn't fit in too well with the society he was living in. He was very well educated. He learned Greek and Italian and Latin, and knew all the classics, knew the English language classics as well. He knew the Hindu scriptures in translation. He knew the Bible, knew philosophy. Very, very well educated. In fact, he attended Harvard. And yet, the result was not someone who was ready to go and be successful in the way that society saw as successful at the time. Instead, it was somebody who constantly, throughout his life, challenged society and society's beliefs in the way he lived, and especially in the things he wrote. Thoreau writes Resistance to Civil Government as a challenge to both the government as it existed in his time and to promote the importance of the individual. He opens by speaking philosophically about government, and he says, that government is best which governs least. And he says that the natural conclusion from that idea is that the very best government would be no government. And then in a very optimistic, romantic fashion, he says, when, not if, but when people are good enough, that is the kind of government they will have. So the Romantics were very optimistic. They believed in the value of the individual. They believed that the individual could find and discover truth for him or herself without needing a teacher or something else. And that human beings, if they would choose to do so, could live in the right way, the correct way, and would not even need a government. Thoreau really believed that. Now, he is practical enough that within a little bit he says, but to speak practically, I'm not an anarchist, he says. Basically, I'm paraphrasing here. I'm not asking for no government, I'm asking for a better government at once. And then the rest of his essay is dedicated to how everyday citizens of conscience who object to things that the government is doing could go about getting that better government. And what he says is that as citizens of the country, sometimes it is necessary for us to break the laws. He says, we know that there are laws that are unfair, that exist, that aren't right. He says most of the time government is probably stricter and meaner than it needs to be, more controlling, and that it gets in its own way. It tries to do something good and it gets in its own way, and it just makes things worse. So if Thoreau were walking around today, he would align most closely with the libertarian perspective on government. Very, very limited, with as much freedom for as many people as possible. Thoreau then argues that it is our job as people with consciences, as citizens that are educated and have a conscience, to stand up to the government when bad laws are passed and to say, no, we won't take it. And he demonstrates that if enough people are willing to do that, the law will fail because there won't be anybody to enforce it. Now, Thoreau never applied this in particular in his lifetime, except before he wrote it when he was arrested for not paying his taxes. But this book, with Thoreau's ideas of peacefully resisting unjust rule by governments and the importance of the individual and the necessity of individual freedom, goes on to inspire Mahatma Gandhi to lead a peaceful revolution that defeats the greatest military power in the world at the time and frees India from British rule. And then Dr. King was looking at Gandhi, and then through Gandhi to Thoreau and the original source of the ideas, as well as looking at the Bible and its teachings that he knew as a minister about peace and turning the other cheek, to present a nonviolent, civil disobedient way of protesting segregation and those laws that were terribly racist that were on the books at the time. It continues to be the root of peaceful protest in our country. Now, civil disobedience, Thoreau did suggest that a person should be willing to go break the law that they feel is wrong in order to demonstrate their objection and to demonstrate that it is wrong, and then be willing to suffer whatever the consequences are to demonstrate that, this isn't some violent thing you're doing. So civil disobedience, then, is a great call for individual freedom and the rights of the individual, and it is also a definition, Thoreau's definition, of what it means to be a good citizen and what a good government looks like, a good democracy looks like. In Walden, Thoreau is objecting to the society, other aspects of the society around him more generally. In his lifetime, Thoreau saw the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and the end result of the Industrial Revolution has been the materialistic, consumer-oriented culture that we have today, where almost everything we do is based around buying stuff, and buying stuff as cheaply as possible. People joke about the point of life being the person with the most toys wins. But if we didn't understand that and accept at least a version of that as true, it wouldn't be funny. It wouldn't make any sense. Thoreau saw that we were headed this way 200 years ago, and he objected strenuously. He looked at the society around him and he said, everybody is spending all of their time trying to get money so that they can have more stuff. He argued that one should spend their life living, not earning a living. And he argued that we would be happiest if we simplified our needs to the point where you had a minimal work, enough to survive, to have your clothes, to have a home, and otherwise you pursued other things. What made you happy? What contributed beauty and art and learning to the world? And in Walden, Thoreau asks at the beginning, he says, I have a problem with society. Society is obsessed with getting stuff, and they're obsessed with the news, and they're obsessed with new technology, and yet I read the newspaper and it's the same thing over and over again. I get letters, and most of them don't really say anything important. What are we doing with our time? Why are we really here? What does a good life look like? Well, Thoreau looked around him, and because his problems were with society, he rejected the idea that society could teach him what he needed to know, that universities or churches or philosophers would be able to tell them. All of those things were the products of society, of men, okay, or at least filtered through men in their creation. Thoreau wanted something more natural. And like most romantics, I already said that Thoreau believed truth was available to all of us without teachers if we would pay attention. One of the primary sources of that was the natural world. Thoreau was a great naturalist. He knew nature very, very well. He made a number of scientific contributions to ecology and the study of nature, and environmentalists still look very much to his writing as an early person who thought the way they think, in addition to being a philosopher on freedom. But Thoreau goes to the woods and he says, I'm going to go there to learn from nature. And this is a very typical romantic idea. And part of the idea is, well, man created society, but God, small g, not necessarily the Christian God. Thoreau was not a traditional believer, but he did believe that there was a deity and that deity was basically good and cared about us. He believed that nature, unlike society, was created directly by God. So if we went and studied nature and how it worked and tried to learn from nature and then apply that to our own lives, we would discover the kind of truths that would teach us all about life, what is important, what we need to know, all of those things. So he went and got permission from Emerson to build a cabin by Walden Pond on some land that belonged to Emerson outside Cambridge, Massachusetts. And he lived there in this cabin that he built himself for 2 years and kept a journal and studied nature. Now, he wasn't a hermit. He went into town almost every day and he ate dinner with Emerson a lot. So this wasn't like a Jim Bridger experience where he went out to the mountains and saw no human beings for months and years at a time. It was a rejection of the traditional way other people were living. He was still willing to talk to people and see people. He came into town most days for part of the day. And he kept a detailed journal of those years. And using that journal, he wrote the book Walden, which is both his philosophical thinking about what he learned by being there in nature and thinking about these questions and challenges to society, and also a demonstration of how other people might do it. A demonstration of how he studied nature, learned the principles that made nature work the way it did, and then how he thought about and applied those to his own life and to human behavior, and how that was the way that he tried to learn from nature. As you read Civil Disobedience and Walden, keep these ideas in mind. Realize civil disobedience, or resistance to civil government, as Thoreau called it, has literally changed the world. It's one of the few books that's not a book of scripture that has literally changed the world. The world is different in significant ways because that book was written. And Walden is just as profound a challenge to society in Thoreau's day. We haven't changed any. As a matter of fact, we are miles down the road, the same road we were headed down as a society when Thoreau objected to it. He has some very powerful and important questions to ask us to consider about how we live and how we choose to live. I hope you enjoy the reading. Of course, I'm available to you to try to help if you run into problems. And the textbook has a lot of notes as you go through. I look forward to seeing the responses you give me.